So now we come to the third part, where this is much more specifically Gandhi's idea of both Naitalim, but I'm connecting his idea of education with non-violence in human nature. I mentioned this in the course of the lecture. So a conviction that further motivated Gandhi was his basic belief in the fundamentally non-violent, intrinsically good, and inherently intelligent and non-aggressive disposition of human nature. So he was not a sort of pessimist about human beings, very much an optimist. He held to this belief despite history's apparent falsification of this supposed fact about human nature. Thus, the task that faced him was to identify the particular deficiency in social process that gives rise to frustration, fear, ignorance, and anger, which more often than not manifest themselves as acts of gratitude or violence. In so doing, Gandhiji thought he would have also identified the root cause of violence. Although there is much controversy as to whether Gandhi actually understood and appreciated the complex historical actuality and species nature of the human condition, as recent researchers in psychology, biology, and psychoanalysis have attempted to highlight, such as Erickson. Gandhi considered, however, that human beings are, quote, at times seen acting like an animal. Well, that's a fair comment on animal. I'd rather think that human beings are not acting like animals, but like rakshasas, which human beings can grow into. Anyway, he is endowed. He means human beings are endowed with brute force as well, what Hobbes called the law of nature, the brute. And so long as he has not developed awareness of his spiritual nature, he remains an intelligent animal, or in Aristotle's sense, a rational animal, but not in Aristotle's terms of a fully developed political zone, a fully developed rational being. For Kant, for Gandhi, a human being is not a fully developed, intelligent, spiritual being, which is what he wants to see. Fear invariably unleashes the brute force of violence in human beings. On animals, I think if I were a Gandhian, I would totally revise and say animals are very capable of being intelligent and spiritual at the same time. In any event, education, when it is to be true to human nature, as Gandhi conceived it, must tackle these seeds of violence and find ways of diffusing them, or preventing their eruption, and rechanneling the same energy into more creative and constructive channels, a move undoubtedly in keeping with Freudian insights. Better still, if there is a way of directing human development away from these detrimental affectations into more positive and creative channels, indeed more purposive areas of growth, then only the task in hand could be fully realized. The presence of fear, anxiety, anger, and lack of self-confidence and self-affirmation were, in Gandhi's analysis, among the more immediate causes of violence, however justified that may seem in terms of the degree of oppression, suffering, poverty, wrong, injustice, opponents of the oppressive system may have inflicted or perpetuated. So a basic assumption of the technique for countering this violence, as we indicated, is that no harm or injury, hatred or violence should be directed either in thought, word or deed to another, least of all to the opponent or adversary, in protesting against the wrongdoings, injustices, and so on. But these are dispositions and habits of the mind and body that have to be developed. Firstly, outside the conflict situation, the very moments when there are no conflicts, and secondly, during the growth and development of character and personality. Unless these dispositions are internalized beyond revocation, and unless they become, as it were, forged with the will, the very seat of the soul force, the good and benign intentions of the individual could well fail her in the real situation where the individual's inner culture is tested. As Thoreau had pointed out, the weakness of the resistors, the people who are protesting, tend to lend greater support to the system being opposed. So you can't be weak, you can't afford to be weak. When translated into educational principles, where such a conflict situation is not normally what faces the pupil, Although there may be occasions for conflicts with teachers and fellow pupils, and also with parents, the aim is to instill an attitude of love, care, and interpersonal harmony. More than that, a feeling of cooperation and of oneness of the group as a virtue to be cultivated. Conscious suffering, Gandhi argued, was a dynamic condition for the non-violent action in any circumstance. Some degree of pain and suffering is not to be shunned, where the act of appealing to another's heart can become the best way to ameliorate the fearful situation. The task of education is to create and foster an environment, internal and external, wherein the tensions and conflicts are imagined and reduced. Gandhi explored other ways of reinforcing and fostering of the ideals of social welfare, justice, individual happiness, freedom, and creativity, which are, of course, basically liberal values, along with spiritual ideals, which he thought provided sustenance to the more fundamental ideals of peace and truth. He also mentioned love. Obviously, human development covers a lot more than basic liberal and religious or spiritual values. This broader concern, however, is not my brief here. Gandhi was aware of the place of health education and social services, as well as rural development, which formed the broader ambience of the basic education had proposed at the Wardha National Education Conference in 1937. To all of this, he extended his principle of nonviolent mode of action. Indeed, no sphere of activity, whether it be individual, personal, interpersonal, social, or national, was to be exempted from the strictures of this moral imperative. The problem, as Gandhi saw it, was how human beings socialize and enculturate their younger population in order to make them into viable members of the society. Obviously, education was the medium. But what sorts of ideals should education pursue? Vimla Rao sums up Gandhi's response to this question in the following quote. True education means self-control and self-discipline to such an extent that it goes against the nature of youth. For example, rules he lays down for a student to observe to belong to his Satyagraha ashram are, to mention a few, the vow of truth, doctrine of ahimsa, the vow of celibacy, the vow of control of the palate, the vow of non-thieving, the vow of swadeshi, the vow of fearlessness, the vow of regarding the untouchables, hand weaving as the same as oneself. In his violently anti-Western mood, Gandhi imposes a Spartan simplicity on the youth. So Gandhi's non-violent anti-Western mood, if this description is at all correct, aside, in the Bhagavad Gita, Gandhi found another support for his principle of action. For the Gita advocated planting the seeds of selfless, dedicated action, nishkama kama or anashakti, which is so very necessary in Gandhi's belief for a non-violent struggle. The fundamental message that Gandhi read in the Gita centered on the seed to exercise asteya, non-coveting, apigraha, non-possessiveness, nishkama karma, selfless action, and brahmacharya, continence. These are not ideals one can learn through books or simply in one's appreciation of literary processes. Rather, they are to be realized through intentional practice, just as one has to be immersed in the meditative practice to realize, for instance, the truth of the Buddhist doctrines of emptiness. Here again, Tolstoy's thought echoing Gandhi's scheme. Where else did Gandhi first attempt to put into practice the Gita's teaching, which he had imbibed in England, but at Tolstoy's farm in Transvaal? Tolstoy's rejection of violence is the very negation of violence was to be of great consequence to Gandhi's thinking. Tolstoy's principle, however, weighed heavily on its emphasis on non-resistance. It was weighted heavily, rather, on its emphasis on non-resistance. Tolstoy had insisted on the insistent application of love in all walks of life for the most efficient resolution of conflict. But this is a negative principle, for its application in practice amounts to little more than withdrawing cooperation with the perceived perpetrators of evil or the wrongdoer. To be sure, this has its parallel in the traditional and classical Indian mode of ahimsa, or not injuring, basically in the Jain principle, not killing, non-harming. But in intent, this is also a negative idea, as Gandhi was insistently reminded by his detractors. There is no positive injunction or exhortation to action accompanying this principle, such as do X or do Y Put simply, it is about doing, not doing why. In that respect, the traditional idea of ahimsa could be seen as non-progressive and non-motivational ethic. Gandhi was therefore anguished about both the Jain principle he had learned from Ramchandra Bai and the non-resistance principle he took from Thoreau and Tolstoy. So finally, Gandhi then maintained his faith in non-violence to the very end. While he intended it to be means to truth and non-violent action as a morally exemplary form of political action, he elevated non-violence as a virtue on a par with truth, obscure as this notion might seem to be. Non-violence is to be valued not simply as a prototype of one what ought to do or not to do, as in the case of Jain ethical teachings, but is the cultivation of an inner disposition or habit of ego mind desire complex that would ensue in a measured action appropriate to the circumstances at hand. Gandhi attributed the lack of this and such virtues to the absence of proper education. So that was the goal of education that Gandhi proposed against the more orthodox educational system and the incoming colonial system of education. Well, thank you for your perseverance and listening through my lecture. Jai Hind, Namaste.